Hello, my name is Robert GEAL and this is my presentation towards an ecocritical adaptation studies. I'm going to argue that there is a humanities methodology with which adaptation studies has not yet engaged in detail, and that this methodology could be enriched by certain existing adaptation studies protocols. If this conference asks for discussion of adaptation and survival, then one of the most important fields to which adaptation studies should turn to help us address pressing real-world issues of survival is ecocriticism, analyses of how various cultural practices reflect and inform human attitudes and behaviours towards the non-human world around us. It's worth beginning with a definition of ecocriticism because, as I'll discuss in a moment, adaptation studies is only just beginning to utilise this methodology. Simon Estock states that it is more than simply the study of nature or natural things in literature. Rather, it is any theory that is committed to effecting change by analysing the function of the natural environment or aspects of it represented in documents that contribute to material practices in material worlds. Ecocriticism is an important tool in helping to effect this change because, as Cheryl Glockfelty puts it, current environmental problems are largely of our own making, are, in other words, a byproduct of culture. Therefore, for Greg Garrard, environmental problems require analysis in cultural as well as scientific terms because they are the outcome of an interaction between ecological knowledge of nature and its cultural inflection. In terms of how adaptation studies has thus far engaged with ecocriticism, it is worth quoting Carl Meekel's recent suggestion for, quote, 3 policy recommendations for a green movement in adaptation studies. I put forth these recommendations in the hopes of raising adaptation studies' climate quietude above a whisper. Although there are certainly some scholars who aren't whispering about this, it is nevertheless the case that the field could be more ecocritical. Indeed, the field has a strong tradition of statements like, it is time for adaptation studies to take a sociological or generic turn. This last call from Thomas Leach comes with an interesting addendum that will be doubly useful for my suggested ecocritical turn. He writes that, with due apologies for my lack of originality, I would suggest that echoing but changing is exactly what all adaptation scholars, and even all lesser organisms do. This is useful, firstly, because I'm going to continue to echo but change the existing ecocritical adaptation studies I'm coming on to, and secondly, because this reference to lesser organisms perhaps alludes to the first example of how existing adaptation studies have used ecological and biological ideas and metaphors. Gary Bortolotti and Linda Hutcheon influentially noted a homology between biological and cultural adaptation, arguing that, quote, stories in a manner parallel to genes replicate. The adaptations of both evolve with changing environments. However, this initial biological turn was used to address the largely non-ecocritical issue which has been so often debated in the field, so that the homology we are offering here does allow a different perspective on some of the theoretical problems around adaptation, especially the issue of fidelity as the major criterion of evaluation. Thus, Bortolotti and Hutcheon state that our principal aim has been to use biological concepts in a heuristic manner to help free narrative adaptation theory from the conceptual restrictions of a misleading evaluative fidelity discourse. This misleading discourse has now been largely displaced, but the biological context here is used to address a largely non-ecocritical issue. There have been more explicitly ecocritical adaptation studies, however. Some of these are case studies, such as these examples. Robert Ray's criticisms of case studies may be unfair here, but his claim that, without the benefit of presiding poetics, film and literature scholars could only persist in asking about individual movies the same unproductive layman's question, has some relevance in my next category of ecocritical adaptation studies, and that is analyses of how different media communicate ecological issues in different ways. Jürgen Brun and Heidi Hart claim that, in, quote, the Annihilation novel-to-film adaptation, the source text can be thought of as a cluster of cultural memes, form and content traits that together constitute the novel's aesthetic setup, as if developing, replicating and mutating with an urge to survive, to breed. Then, the question could be, in which ways can important parts of the novel survive in another cultural and formal biotope or medium like the cinema? They ask, what about the constellation of ideas that we consider perhaps most pervasive in the novel, namely the dissolving of dichotomies in favour of a world infused with a multi-species perspective? How can such a vision be transported into film? While the basics of plot and character are relatively unproblematic to carry across the media-specific differences between novel and film, multi-species thinking lies, so to speak, on a deeper level of the film and is not immediately transferable. This approach considers explicitly eco-critical issues, while conceptualizing different media as having different qualities, which may or may not be conducive to the translation of themes or memes from one medium to another. This can be a useful way for adaptation studies to help the eco-critical analysis of how various texts communicate ecological issues, although, in its current form at least, this approach tends to favour the synchronic nature of intermedial relations, so that it is concerned with how the same idea or meme is communicated in different ways by different media. However, there is also scholarship which thinks of adaptations as having a potentially convergent and cumulative eco-critical effect. Considering the relationships between the Hunger Games novels and films, Nandita Mahajan writes that when the adaptation is perceived as an adaptation, text and image fuse, word and flesh collide. How does this collision impact a story's portrayal of climate change? In such an example, Mahajan conceptualizes the viewer's mind as a site where the convergence of multiple texts enables a specific meaning-making process, which has some effect on the environmental themes of both texts involved. For the viewer who knows both novel and film, the novel's information about Panem's context of climate catastrophe gets combined with the film's rendition of environments. This enhances the story's environmental themes. Such palimpsestuous reading results in thematic consonance. Novel and film work together to generate a weightier environmental message than either conveys on its own. Another nascent form of eco-critical adaptation studies is that which looks beyond human agency, with texts not so much definitively the creations of original artists and adapters, but as active agents seeking, like genes and memes, to reproduce and mutate. Thus, Thomas Leach, asking what movies wants, advocates adopting a view of agency that is less anthropomorphic, which would have the salutary effect of decentering human agency in a world whose survival depends more and more clearly on a global rather than a merely human ecology. Finally, issues of materiality and sustainability have been addressed. Carl Meikle has noted that adaptation as a media practice foregrounds sourcing, source materials, material relations and impact, and asks, are some forms of adaptation greener than others? Is intramedial adaptation more sustainable than intermedial adaptation? Is fan fiction more sustainable than franchising? What do audiences and studios actually reuse in the adaptation process? Therefore, for Meikle, the study of adaptation needs to be joined with the study of recycling, remaking, and every other form of sustainability in the age of the Anthropocene. And, very briefly, I want to add another potential area for adaptation studies to contribute to the eco-critical project. In addition to the synchronic intermedial projects I've mentioned, adaptation studies can explore the intercultural and the diachronic, and can do so in a manner which explores how human attitudes to various aspects of the non-human world around us change and adapt. The texts which we analyse can provide evidence for this historical and intercultural evolution of ideas. One last return to Hutchins' biological homology can clarify this point. Hutchins states that stories propagate themselves when they catch on. Adaptations, as both repetition and variation, are their form of replication. Evolving by cultural selection, travelling stories adapt to local cultures, just as populations of organisms adapt to local environments. What they are not is necessarily inferior or second-rate, or they would not have survived. And the fittest stories do more than survive, they flourish. I would not want to suggest that this isn't a useful way to think of adaptation, but Hutchins' focus here is on the mimetic ingenuity and malleability of certain texts, how their mutated repetitions are not inferior as they flourish. A change of focus could shift from whether the mutated repetitions are inferior or not to how those mutations and repetitions indicate something about how the cultures which produced them conceptualize various eco-critical issues, like, for example, relationships between humans and non-humans. Take the various stories collected in Ovid's Metamorphoses as an example. The repeated adaptation of stories like Pygmalion, about a non-living statue magically transformed into a living human, are clearly not second-rate. They have flourished. What the eco-critical lens can add here is an analysis of how texts like this reveal something about the evolution of culturally and historically specific attitudes to relationships between humans and non-humans. How antiquity's benevolent Pygmalion reveals different historical attitudes to modernity's Monstrous Frankenstein, or the underlying cultural differences which produced the human-non-human hybrids, the Terminator, and Major from Ghost in the Shell. Finally, I'd like to ask anyone working on ecocritical adaptation studies or anyone aware of any work I've missed to contact me. There may be opportunities for collaboration, perhaps something like an edited collection, depending on the extent to which there is an appetite for an eco-critical turn. Thank you.